It was early afternoon when I overheard the conversation, just the kind of moment you wish you'd never stumbled into. I had been waiting outside the conference room, scrolling through emails on my phone, when I heard the voices. The door to the boardroom was cracked open, and I didn't mean to eavesdrop. But the words cut through the air so clearly, I couldn't ignore them. Mason's voice was unmistakable. It was confident, sharp, with that tone that always made people listen, even if they didn't want to. I wasn't supposed to be there, not anymore, apparently. The junior VPs were there too, laughing along with him, and the laughter sent a cold shiver down my spine. "It's like that old stapler, right?" Mason chuckled. "You know, it sits there on your desk. Used to be useful, but now it's just taking up space." A ripple of laughter followed. I froze. The words settled on my skin, like a weight I couldn't shake, outdated, obsolete. That's what I was. I tried to steady my breath, but my mind was already spinning. They were talking about me. The stapler comment, unbelievable, was about me, just taking up space. I should have walked away. I should have turned around, gone back to my office, pretended I hadn't heard it, but I didn't. I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot. Mason's voice filtered out again, just as cutting as before. "No one even remembers how much work it took to build that whole system. She's all old infrastructure, man." Another laugh. I had given my life to this company, the late nights, the weekends, the years I'd spent in these offices, running systems that spanned continents, building frameworks, securing data, laying the groundwork for the global network that had made us leaders in the industry. Did that mean nothing? Was I nothing but a used stapler, as Mason so kindly put it? I felt something stir in me. Anger, hurt, disbelief, but there was no place for that here, not now. I was invisible to them, an afterthought. What could I do about it? A junior VP added, "Right? She's been around forever, but now it's all about speed, modernization." The conversation shifted, but the weight of those words was all I could hear. The world I'd spent years building, with every ounce of my energy, was being rewritten, dismissed in minutes, and there I stood, ignored and belittled, unable to respond, unable to fight back. I swallowed hard, clenching my fists at my sides. I didn't feel angry, not yet anyway. But something inside me was starting to crack. I had given everything for this company. I had trusted it, believed it was more than just a paycheck. But hearing those words, seeing how easily they dismissed me, it was as if everything I had built, every sacrifice I had made, was nothing. I turned, walked away quietly. As I made my way down the hallway, my mind spun with questions. Did they even see me? Did they know who I was, what I had done for this company? And yet, as I walked to my office, those questions dissolved. I couldn't fight their perception. I couldn't change what was already written in their minds. I was nothing more than a stapler. The weight of Mason's words lingered with me for days, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. It wasn't just the insult. It was the realization that everything I'd spent my life building was being dismantled. I hadn't expected to be made obsolete, not after all the sacrifices I'd made for this company, but Mason's casual dismissal had shattered that illusion. I had been here from the beginning. I'd helped shape the systems that had made us successful. How could they just throw it all away, as if that wasn't enough? The shifts within the company started to unfold before me in a way I hadn't anticipated. I sat in my office staring at the old leather-bound folder I'd kept tucked away in my desk drawer. It was my employment agreement from 2008, the one I'd written myself. The safeguards, the clauses, all carefully inserted to protect me and the company if things ever got messy. I hadn't needed it in years, but now, as I skimmed through the pages, I found one clause in particular that caught my attention. It was a provision I'd added to prevent exactly what I was seeing unfold now. The company was shifting towards rapid innovation, embracing a new focus on streamlining, on cutting costs, and on outsourcing. But that clause, the one I had inserted all those years ago, was my first true indication that the company was veering off track. The system I had so carefully built, the one that had made Stratusport a global player, was starting to show cracks. As I reread the clause, a sinking feeling grew in my stomach. Mason was making decisions that would undo all of it. He was replacing experienced personnel, replacing the very foundation of the infrastructure I had built. His modernization was just another word for tearing apart the systems that had made us strong. Outsourcing key components, cutting access to vital systems. It all sounded like a recipe for disaster, and I could feel it in my bones that we were heading towards it. The panic really set in when I saw the vendor report from Prague. My eyes skimmed over the data. Unauthorized access. Protocol bypassed. The words hit me like a punch in the gut. The very system designed to protect the company was being undermined. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I read the details. Unauthorized activity. Bypass security measures. It was clear to me that Mason's vision for the company was creating gaping holes in our defenses. What was worse was that no one was paying attention. No one except me. The company was heading towards collapse, and Mason's shiny new systems were eroding everything we had worked for. My fingers hovered over my phone as I thought about sending a report, but I already knew it wouldn't matter. The decision makers weren't interested in the truth. They were too caught up in the race to keep up with the latest buzzwords. I stared at the screen, feeling the weight of my position, and realized for the first time that I was the only one who could stop this. But would anyone listen? Would they even care? I hit the save button on my draft and stood up from my desk, my mind already racing with what I had to do next. It was time to take action. It didn't take long for the reality to sink in after that conversation with Mason. The laughs from the meeting still echoed in my mind as I sat at my desk, trying to focus on something, anything that would make the hurt go away. But there was no escaping it. They didn't just dismiss me in that meeting, they were erasing me. Slowly, methodically, they were stripping away my relevance. I had given everything for this company. I had sacrificed nights, weekends, my personal life. All for the greater good of building something that would stand the test of time. And now, in a matter of weeks, I was watching it crumble. It started with something small, a meeting invitation I wasn't included in, a brief email with no mention of the upcoming compliance meeting that everyone had assumed I'd be attending. Just a note, as if to say, "Don't worry about it, we've got it covered." It seemed insignificant at first, but it set off a chain of questions in my head. I had been the one to design the global compliance system from scratch. I knew the intricacies better than anyone. I knew the gaps, the risks, the vulnerabilities, and now, it seemed, they didn't think I was needed anymore. I tried to bring it up in one of our leadership meetings. I figured maybe they had just missed something. Maybe they weren't aware of the complexities of the compliance process. I raised my hand, waiting for the right moment to speak up. "Mason, I just want to make sure the new protocols are aligned with our global compliance guidelines," I said carefully, choosing my words. "There are certain variables that—" "You're not part of this discussion, Jenna," Mason cut me off, his voice flat and dismissive. He didn't even look at me. "We're streamlining, remember? Just leave the details to the team." I felt my face flush, but I kept my composure. The others in the room barely reacted. The lack of acknowledgement stung, but I tried not to show it. I tried not to let the weight of his words crush me, but they did. The meeting moved on without a second glance at me. As I sat there, my role in the company felt like it was slipping away, bit by bit. The more they streamlined, the less I seemed to matter. Later that day, I logged into the system to check on some of the project updates, only to find that my access to several key modules had been revoked. The familiar interface I'd spent years navigating was suddenly restricted. The permissions, once mine by right, by years of hard work and trust, were no longer available to me. I tried to log into a few other systems, only to be met with the same barrier. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I was being sidelined. This wasn't just about the new team. This wasn't just a shift in priorities. They were cutting me off, quietly erasing the years of experience I had built here. I couldn't help but feel the weight of my isolation. How did it come to this? How had I gone from being a key player in the company's success to a ghost in the machine? This slow, steady exclusion felt like a quiet betrayal. I had given everything, and in return, I was discarded, overlooked, left to fade into the background. But what stung the most was that I wasn't angry. Not yet. I wasn't even fighting back. I was simply watching, waiting, unsure of what to do next. The company was changing, and I was being left behind. As I sat in my office, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been betrayed. Not just by Mason or the others, but by the very system I had built. I had trusted that this company would value me, but now I wasn't sure if they ever had. The silence that followed my exclusion was deafening, but I couldn't leave. I wasn't ready to walk away yet. I just needed to understand where this was all headed and how I could fight back. Because if there was one thing I knew for sure, it was that I wasn't going down without a fight. The day started like any other, mundane, predictable, the usual bustle of office life humming around me, but something had changed. The invisible wall that had been slowly growing between me and the leadership was now unmistakable. I logged into my system, intending to check the status of ongoing projects, only to be greeted with an unexpected roadblock. Access denied. I stared at the message, my fingers hovering over the mouse. I tried again, just in case there had been some glitch, but no. The same notification popped up. I had been locked out of the system. My first instinct was to dismiss it. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone had reconfigured permissions, but surely they wouldn't lock me out entirely, right? But as I went through the motions, checking one system after another, my worst fear began to materialize. My access was being systematically revoked. Modules that I had worked on for years, designed from the ground up, were now off limits to me. The very systems I had built were being pulled out from under me, piece by piece. I sat back in my chair, my head spinning. This wasn't just a technical error or a temporary glitch. It was a message, a clear signal that I no longer had a place here. I could feel the familiar sting of betrayal. But this time it wasn't the searing heat of anger. It was something colder, more calculated. The years of sacrifice, the sleepless nights spent fine-tuning protocols and building the infrastructure that had kept the company running, were being wiped out in the blink of an eye. My work, my legacy, was vanishing. I was being erased from the system, but it wasn't just the loss of access that hurt. It was the silence that followed. No one came to explain why. No one acknowledged the fact that I had built this system, that I had been its guardian for so many years. The entire structure I had devoted myself to was being dismantled without a word. I picked up the phone, considering reaching out to someone, anyone, who might still care, but I knew it wouldn't help. I knew I wouldn't get an answer that would make sense or change anything. Instead, I opened the records to the upcoming global compliance meeting. Once again, my name was missing from the list. I was supposed to be the expert, the one to lead that conversation, but there was nothing. No invitation, no acknowledgement. It was as if I had never existed in this role to begin with. I closed the window and sat there, staring at the screen, the weight of everything I had built, the years, the effort, the sacrifices, suddenly felt like it was nothing more than a fleeting memory, a whisper lost to time. I didn't let the anger surface. I didn't allow myself to lash out. Even though the betrayal was unbearable, there would be no confrontation, no emotional outburst. That would be what they expected. What they probably wanted, in fact. They wanted me to show weakness, to give them a reason to further devalue me, but I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, took a deep breath, and began to plan. I had been part of the system for too long to let it all fall apart without a fight. If they wanted to erase me, they would have to do it without my help, and when the time came, I would ensure that their actions had consequences, real consequences. I wasn't going to let them destroy everything I had built. The feeling of helplessness had crept up on me over the past few weeks, but now it was overwhelming. I couldn't shake the growing certainty that the company I had given everything to was crumbling under its own weight. Mason, with his push for rapid innovation, was changing things too fast, too recklessly. The security breach was just the beginning. It happened when I was reviewing a set of system logs that had come through my inbox. One of our top vendors in Prague had flagged an alert about unauthorized activity within the system. I had assumed it was just another glitch, but as I dug deeper, I realized it was something far more concerning. The protocols I'd painstakingly put in place to prevent exactly this kind of breach were being bypassed. Someone, likely in-house, had overridden safeguards without following the proper authorization process. And it was not the first time. My heart sank as I traced the digital footprints left behind. It was clear that Mason's decision to centralize key functions and streamline oversight had led to massive gaps in our security systems. Every system I'd designed to keep us ahead of potential threats, every layer of protection was being torn down to make room for faster, more efficient alternatives. And this was the result. I compiled the findings into a detailed report, outlining the risks, the potential impact on the company's security, and the glaring gaps that had been introduced. But as I had learned over the past few weeks, Mason wasn't interested in my opinion. It had become clear to me that my voice no longer mattered. I sent the report to Mason and the executive team, but when his reply came, it wasn't the thoughtful response I was hoping for. Instead, it was dismissive, condescending even. He had brushed off the warning with a note that practically screamed, "Don't worry about it. Thanks for the input, Jenna. We're moving in a new direction now. Let's leave this to the experts." That was it. No acknowledgement of the grave security risks I had pointed out. No interest in understanding the implications. Just a cold dismissal, packaged in professional-sounding jargon. I closed the email and stared at the screen for a long time. How could they not see it? How could they ignore the damage they were about to cause? But deep down, I knew the answer. They didn't care. They didn't understand the infrastructure they were tampering with, nor did they have the experience to grasp the full scope of the risks involved. The company was racing towards disaster, and they were blind to the consequences. For a moment, I felt the familiar sting of frustration, but I didn't react. I wasn't going to let them see me riled up. Instead, I took a deep breath and let the numbness take over. This wasn't the time for anger. This was the time to act. Quietly, strategically. I had to be smarter than they were. If they were going to let it all fall apart, then it was up to me to make sure they couldn't destroy everything I had built. It was the middle of the afternoon when I received the email. The subject line was simple: automated termination notice. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe there had been some kind of glitch in the system, some error that triggered an impersonal message to my inbox. But as I read the words, it became clear this wasn't a mistake. I wasn't going to get a warning, a meeting, or even a phone call from HR. They were cutting me off, just like that. Your employment with Stratusport has been terminated, effective immediately. The cold robotic tone sent a shiver down my spine. I sat there, staring at the screen, unable to breathe for a moment. But then it hit me, not a wave of panic or anger, but a realization. I had known this was coming. For weeks, I had watched as my role diminished, as my work was slowly erased by decisions made at the top. It wasn't just the exclusion from meetings, or the revocation of system access, or even Mason's dismissive attitude. It was the fact that I had been quietly, systematically written out of the company's story. And now, they were finishing the job. There was no point in trying to fight it. They had already made their decision, and nothing I could say would change it. No more emails, no more requests for clarification, just a cold, final termination. I wasn't even worth the decency of a personal conversation. But instead of reacting with the anger I had felt building up inside me for so long, I felt calm, empty, but calm. They had underestimated me, but that was their mistake. I had anticipated this. I had already prepared for this moment years ago when I quietly embedded a contingency safeguard into the system. A safeguard that had one simple rule: if the system was ever compromised, it would lock out all global access and disable key operations. I didn't hesitate. I logged into the system, bypassing the usual protocols, and activated the safeguard I had created long ago. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but I could feel the shift in the infrastructure. Slowly, the systems I had worked on for years began to lock down. A small smile crept across my face. The company might think they were done with me, but I was about to remind them of just how much they depended on what I built. I watched the screens as global access started to shut down across multiple continents. The red flags started popping up. Emergency alerts, system warnings. Everything I had put in place to protect the company from itself was now working against them. Mason's desire for quick innovation was about to crash headfirst into the security gaps he had ignored. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the cascading alerts on my screen. There was no turning back now. The system was in motion, and it would run its course. As the minutes ticked by, my phone started buzzing, frantic calls from Mason and a few other members of the leadership team. I didn't answer. They would call again, and when they did, I would calmly explain that the system was simply following the protocol I had set up years ago, a rule that Mason had unknowingly triggered. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control, even if only for a moment. The company's infrastructure was unraveling, piece by piece, and I was the only one who could prevent total collapse. They had underestimated me, and I would make sure they remembered it. The first signs of chaos started slowly, like a crack in the dam before the water rushes through. But as the hours passed, it became clear this wasn't just a glitch or a system error, this was happening. I sat at my desk, staring at the alerts popping up on my screen. Global access was being systematically shut down. Connections were dropping, systems were failing, and everywhere I looked, the infrastructure I had built was unraveling. Mason had no idea what was happening yet. I knew that because I saw his name flashing across my phone. His name and several others from the leadership team, each calling frantically, but I didn't answer. I didn't need to. They would all be scrambling, trying to fix something they couldn't understand. The system I had carefully constructed was now dismantling itself. I leaned back in my chair and watched, calmly, the alerts, the notifications, the system failures. Each one a small victory. I had known it would come to this, and now the system was doing exactly what I had designed it to do. It wasn't revenge, not exactly. It was a natural consequence, one that Mason had unknowingly triggered with his reckless decisions. A call came through from Mason. I glanced at the screen, watching the name flash on and off, then let it go to voicemail. He would leave a message, but it wouldn't matter. The rules were already in motion. The minutes dragged on, and soon the phone started buzzing again. Mason's voice was frantic, his words laced with confusion. "Jenna, what's happening? Why are we losing access to everything? The systems are crashing. What's going on?" I leaned forward in my chair, eyes fixed on the monitors. There was no point in responding right away. I knew he would call again, and when he did, I would calmly explain that the system was simply following the protocol I had set in place, a safeguard I had built for a situation just like this. It didn't matter how much he shouted or how many calls came in. I had the power now. And it was clear he didn't understand the scope of what was happening. His panic grew more pronounced with each call, his voice becoming more erratic. "Jenna, please, you have to help. This is bad, really bad. What can we do?" I could almost hear the desperation in his tone, but I stayed quiet. I wasn't going to be the one to fix this mess. They had chosen this path. They had dismissed my warnings, and now the consequences were unavoidable. Minutes passed, then an hour. Still, the system continued to lock down across the globe. Every time Mason tried to connect with me, the same response came: silence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mason called once more. This time, his voice was more subdued. I could tell he was beginning to piece things together, even if he didn't fully understand how it had happened. "Jenna," he said, his voice heavy. "Did you do this? Did you set this up?" I paused for a moment before speaking. "Yes," I said simply. "I did." There was a long pause on the other end, followed by the sound of Mason's exhale, the weight of the realization settling in. "This was always your plan, wasn't it?" he asked, sounding resigned. "It was always a possibility," I replied calmly. "A safeguard. You triggered it, Mason. The system is just following the rules." I could hear the frustration in his voice as he tried to grasp the enormity of the situation. "But why? Why are you doing this? This is the company we built together." I didn't respond right away. His words stung, but I wasn't about to let my emotions show. This wasn't about emotions. This was about the company's future, and right now, I was the one holding the keys to stop the disaster. The minutes ticked by, and Mason's voice grew softer, as if he were finally starting to understand the scale of the disaster he had set in motion. "We've lost everything, haven't we?" "Yes," I said simply. "And now, you'll understand what I've been trying to tell you all along." As I listened to his silence, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in months, I felt like I had control over something, anything. The power I had felt slipping away from me had returned, and the only thing left was to watch the consequences unfold. I didn't answer Mason's next call. He would have to find his own way out of this one, and as I watched the global collapse continue, I knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The hours stretched on, and the world outside my office window seemed oblivious to the disaster unfolding within the company. I had triggered the protocol, and now the systems were collapsing under their own weight. I watched in silence, the cascade of alerts and failures appearing on my screens, like dominoes falling one by one. Global access was locked, security protocols were triggered, and the entire infrastructure that I had built was unraveling before my eyes. The calls from Mason kept coming, his frantic voice leaving increasingly desperate messages, but I didn't return them. He needed to face the consequences of his actions. He had pushed aside every bit of experience, every warning, and now the collapse was inevitable. I had warned him, but he'd ignored me. Now he was realizing, too late, that there were consequences to dismissing the systems that had kept the company safe. As the systems continued to falter, I received an unexpected call. It was Charles Branford, the retired founder of Stratasport, the man who had built the company from the ground up. I had worked closely with him in the early years, and despite the way the company had shifted in recent times, I respected him more than anyone in the current leadership. He was one of the few people who understood the value of what had been built. "Jenna," his voice came through the line, thick with regret. "I heard what's happening, and He hesitated for a moment. "I just want to say I'm sorry. This isn't the company I wanted us to become. You're the reason Stratasport grew to what it is today, and I should have said this sooner." For a moment, I was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. It was strange, hearing someone finally acknowledge my contributions, especially after everything that had happened. But it didn't erase the years of work being erased by people who didn't understand. "Thank you, Charles," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It's too late for apologies. I've already watched everything I built be disregarded." "I know," he said, his voice tight. I want you to know that I do understand, and I regret what they've done. You're a cornerstone of this company, and the fact that they've treated you this way, it's wrong." I exhaled slowly, letting his words wash over me, but even as I processed the comfort in his acknowledgement, it didn't change the fact that I was standing at the end of a chapter I had helped write, one that was now coming to a close. "I've decided it's time to move on," I said. "Stratasport is no longer what it was, and I can't keep fighting for something that no longer values what it was built on." "I understand," Charles said quietly, "but if you ever want to talk, or if you need anything from me, don't hesitate." "I won't," I replied, the finality in my tone unmistakable. "But I think it's time for me to move on, and I think it's time for Stratasport to face what's coming." As I hung up the phone, the weight of the decision settled in. It was one thing to know you were undervalued, to see your hard work erased. It was another to walk away from it all with your head held high. I stared at the office door for a moment, then stood up from my desk. The screens in front of me were still flashing, alerts, failure reports, system shutdowns, but I no longer felt any urge to fight it. I had done what I could. I had set the systems in place, and I had done everything in my power to protect it. Now, the company had to deal with the fallout. I felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe it was the weight lifting off my shoulders, or maybe it was the understanding that I had finally taken control of the situation, even if it meant stepping away from everything I'd worked for. I turned off my computer, grabbed my things, and walked out of my office for the last time. As I stepped into the elevator, the doors closing softly behind me, I didn't feel anger or frustration. I felt something else, something liberating. A new chapter was waiting, and Stratasport, for all its flaws, was no longer my concern. It was time to move on. For the first time in years, I felt free. The offer came to me just as I had settled into my new reality, one where the weight of corporate betrayal was no longer hanging over me. For the first time in months, I felt unburdened. The world outside my office was no longer a place I had to fight to be seen. Stratasport was behind me, and for the first time, I felt truly free. The offer was from a non-profit software firm, a small but passionate organization that worked to provide technology solutions for underserved communities. The salary wasn't the highest I'd ever been offered, but the work felt different. It resonated with me in a way that the corporate world never had. I sat at my desk, the contract open in front of me. My fingers hovered over the mouse, poised to click accept, But I didn't immediately. I thought about the years I had spent building Stratasport's infrastructure, about the sacrifices, the late nights, the pride I had once felt in what we had built. I thought about the world I had left behind. And yet, this offer felt like a fresh start. I leaned back in my chair, considering my next steps. Stratasport had been my life for so long. And now, as I read over the contract, I realized I had spent so much of my time fighting to prove my worth to a company that had already decided it was time for me to go. The money, the status, the shiny corporate perks. They had never filled the void I had felt for years. I'd been seeking validation from the wrong place. This nonprofit, this small firm, offered something I had longed for: purpose, impact, a chance to build something meaningful, not for profit, but for real change. I no longer needed the corporate world's validation. I knew the value of my work, and I no longer needed to fight for their recognition. I glanced at my phone, the Stratasport emails that had been pinging nonstop all morning. I no longer cared. The notifications, the unanswered calls from Mason, they were nothing more than reminders of a company that had left me behind. I clicked accept. I didn't hesitate. And in that moment, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I wasn't leaving behind a failed company or an ungrateful team. I was embracing something new, something that aligned with my values, something that made sense to me beyond the spreadsheets and the endless meetings. The sound of the email confirmation hitting my inbox was oddly satisfying. It was final. This was my new beginning. I sat back in my chair, letting out a long, deep breath. There was no fear, no regret, just freedom. I had spent years building something others would never appreciate, but now I could build something that truly mattered. And that, in the end, was all that had ever mattered to me. For the first time in a long while, I felt at peace.